Hello everyone. How are you guys doing? So today I'll be discussing a uh, very important concept in security. This is something widely used, and however, like the implementation or the protocol behind the scenes, sometimes it may not be very clear. So I, what I'm trying to discuss is basically single sign-on, which is basically when you see these applications, right? Like you can use like Google sign in or SML or like YouTube or Facebook sign in, right? So basically you using those services or apps using the authentication of Google or your Gmail or your Microsoft email, right? So here what is happening is like the service itself, like the app itself is not is not utilizing their own authentication system, meaning like they're not keeping the record of username passwords for each and every user, which actually good for the service or application itself because they don't have the burden of managing this username and password, right? So what they do is like they just offload the authentication responsibility to some other third party, in this case probably Google or Microsoft or some big names that contains the emails of vast majority of people, and it's very easy for them to authenticate because they have since all users have already signed up or registered with them, right? So basically that's the single sign-on, but there are generally two common types of single sign-on implementation that you can do. One is SAML based, which is like assertion markup language, which is called, basically it's an XML based protocol, meaning like the information is shared at the backend using like the is used is information shared at the backend is basically an XML document or XML format. And the counterpart of SAML is OAuth2 or like OIDC, which is basically built on top of OAuth2 protocol, and which is basically saying it operates on like the JSON Web Token. So JSON Web Token, if you're not familiar with, is a basically token with having different combination of information. Let me see if I can give you a quick example of JSON Web Token. JSON Web Token example. Anyways, it's basically a JSON format, and it has different information. For example, like your username, user email ID, and which group you belong to, right? So first, let's go into the SMS SAML or security assertion markup language-based authentication. So the protocol flow almost same for both SAML and OIDC. Just very few subtle differences. First of all, we should assume that there is a setup stage where you have to set up the SML provider with the particular app or service. There is a different process for that. I believe we are assuming that that setup has been done for the respective identity providers. So we are not discussing the setup. Like this is more of like developer side, like how users or developers can set up the IDP for their application or services. So basically, what it happens is like a user. We start from here. Like a user tries to log into an application. So they go to like say they go to the www.example.com, and it then needs to sign up. So it presents it with the option or button saying that sign in with Google, right? So when you click on that button, what happens is like that request been forwarded to the, so for first you make a request to get the page of the service provider. In this case, service provider is the app itself, like the service that we want to use. So when you open up the browser for the service provider, this is the first request going in, right? And then when you click on the button of doing the Google signing, then the service provider forwards the request to, basically here it's saying that it's forwards the request to the browser, and from browser it's going to the identity provider, which is basically your Google IDP. If in the case of you're using like the Gmail ID to do the single sign on, right? So your you can see that page for Google in this case, which is like a sign in with your Gmail ID, username, password. So in this case, like the user will be providing their email, Gmail ID and password. And once the authentication is successful, right, and then IDP. So here saying IDTP initiated flow. So basically what this means is like IDP sends a request, authenticate the user first, and then sends a SML assertion. So basically, like the document that tells about the user's identity, the users that just authenticated, it's structured in an SML assertion file. So there is an example. I have done some research. Where is that? So basically, it's an XML document containing like information for the user. For example, this, right? Like it will have the user name, email, first name, last name, and it's basically an XML document. So here, right? So it sends that SML assertion back to the service provider. Now here, basically SML, like service provider has to verify that SML assertion, meaning that it comes with a signature of the identity provider, and SML service provider verifies that if this SML assertion is coming from the authorized identity provider, or like the legitimate identity provider. The way they do the verification is they do some signature check with the private key and public key combination. So public key is available for the identity provider to the service provider. So they just do the verification of like signature verification, and once the verification is successful, they know that this SML assertion language is valid, and they extract the user information, right? So now the service provider has the user information that is trying to authenticate, and based on that, those user information, service provider can set up different access policies or different resource access on the resources. So the access, uh, so the authorization, so authentication is taken care by the identity provider, but the authorization is maintained by the service provider here. So number seven, if you see here, like the users is authenticated, SP sends a security context to the browser. Yeah, so security context to the browser basically is trying to say is like it will set up some kind of session, or maybe some kind of JWT, depending on the mechanism. It will set up some kind of session with the browser, and from then on, with that authenticated session, user can make a request to the resources of the service provider, and service provider manages the authorization, meaning like what that particular user can see or cannot see in their own service, and based on that, it returns the requested resources to the end user. So basically, it's a three-way communication, and identity provider is maintaining the authentication of the, or verifying the authentication identity of the user is done by the identity provider. And main difference is like the authentication document is which is called SML assertion, which is an XML based document that has been shared with the service provider. Now, if you go into like the OIDC, yeah, if you go into OIDC, it's the same, almost the same concept, except in this case, instead of SAML assertion or XML document, a JWT token is being shared. So what I mean by that is, if you look here, again, user and your application, which is like the service provider, and Okta is the like the identity provider, right? So you ignore this generate PKIC code is especially for a different kind of flow. So basically what happens is like users open up the user's application here, and then again like you sign in with, there's a button you see, sign in with Gmail. When you click on the button, or in this case it will be like Okta, sign in with Okta, and when you click on the button, a authorized URL, so a request sent to the authorized URL to the identity provider Okta. So and then Okta provides an authentication prompt, which is like putting the username and password in the Okta for their Okta password name, Okta username and password, and that's been presented to the user in here at stage 3. And stage 4, when user does the authentication, and so there is a consent, a corpus concept of consent, which is basically, are you authorizing this third-party application, this application, to access some of your profile information? So you will see this window sometimes, like, are you authorizing this application, an application, to access your basic information like your name and email? So once you say yes to those consent, it goes back to Okta. Then Okta sends authorization code. So this is something interesting. It doesn't straight away send the JSON token, or doesn't straight away sends the authentication information of the user. It sends an authentication code response, and then from the service, it sends the authorization code to the token endpoint of the IDP, along with the client ID and client secret. I know this is something doesn't make sense, but like, this two-step is basically verifying, like this step here is used to verify that the request is coming from the legitimate client-side application, this application, which is basically whether this application is trusted by the identity provider Okta. So some client ID and secret is transmitted with the authorization code to the token, and those are verified in the Okta sites to see that this service is actually trusted. Once that is verified, then it sends away the access token, which is basically the JW token containing the different information about the user, such as like name, email, and so on. Pretty similar to what we see in the SAML assertion, but this will be in a JSON format. And at the same time, it will say, it may or may not send some other information, such as like the refresh token. So refresh token, what is a refresh token? This is basically a token that would allow when it's given to use to refresh the access token. So what do I mean by that is, like, access token has certain validity, right? But when your access token expires, you have to reinitiate this whole authentication flow again. But if you are provided, if the service is provided with a refresh token, what happens is service can renew the token, or extend the timing or expiration time of the access token using that refresh token, so that you don't have to initiate this authentication flow. You just extend the token lifetime using the refresh token, right? So in this stage, basically you get the JSON token, and from then on, using that JSON token, your service or resource server. So here resource is telling the resource server. So now this is something maybe it's controlled by your application. Basically, I don't know why they're showing it in a different scenario, server side. Okay, so basically it's saying that your service has two components, like it's a client side component and service side component. So this all happening in the client side, on the browser side or server side. Basically, this is like the your application and service server side is the same thing, like same application. And when your JW token is being set in the browser, you send a request with that JW token to the service, your application, and your application checks the JW token and maintain its own authorization policy, like how based on that information, what are the resources you're allowed to see or you're not allowed to see, and based on that it returns the resources to the user. So this is pretty much for OIDC, and OIDC is based on the OAuth 2 protocol. So OAuth 2 is a like it's a upgrade of OAuth 1 and with some extra claims, but this don't worry about those things. So to sum up, like just a comparison is both are SAML based authentication and OIDC based authentication. Both are ways to do the authentication for a service without maintaining the authentication system or username password in the service side, rather than they establish or they use the common identity provider to do the authentication. And the some information is, once the authentication is done by the identity provider, those information is shared with the service, and based on those information, service keeps access to different resources of that service based on those authentication information. And now the sharing of the information format is different. SAML mostly XML based, um, YDC mostly JSON web token, and also the way the mechanism, like the verification mechanism between the service and the identity provider, these varies a little bit, and also the implementation varies a little bit, like how they are the request being sent to which endpoint, both for SAML and OIDC. That's also different. So this is the basic difference between like SAML and OIDC based authentication. But these are both used in the industry, and SAML is mostly like for older application, but modern application mostly uses like OIDC based authentication. So this is the summary. I believe it makes sense. And let me know if you have question. I am reachable at LinkedIn at MD Farhan Haq, and you can also make some comments in the YouTube video. And please like and share the YouTube video. Thank you.